You are watching Reed's Conversations, a podcast series on writing, filmmaking, acting, and theater. For today's episode, I'll have a conversation with producer, screenwriter, and actor Steve Barr. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Reed's Conversations, the podcast series on writing, filmmaking, acting, and theater. Today, I am super excited to have this guest on my show. He is a wonderful producer, screenwriter, and actor, and he's produced some titles that you may recognize. In 2016, he was played the character Deputy Smalls in the 2016 version of Pete's Dragon. Also in New Zealand, he worked as the executive commissioner for Wellington Paranormal. Is that correct, Steve?
Sure. Yeah,
So I'm so happy to have Steve Barr on my show. So Steve, thanks so much again for being on here.
absolutely, Reed. Great to talk to you. Thanks for asking me.
Of course, yeah. And I know currently we're in two different time zones. Where I live in Kentucky in America, it's I think 1:26. So what time is it here in New Zealand right now?
It's 8:26 in the morning, the day after you. It's Friday morning for me, and I think it's Thursday afternoon for you.
Yeah, so you're in the future. You're definitely
I live
13.
in the future. Yeah, don't ask me about the lottery numbers. We get in trouble for that sort of thing.
Oh yeah. Or Doc Brown showing up in his DeLorean time machine.
Yeah, exactly.
Like different time zones. But yeah, so we're just going to have a good time just talking about your creative career. And I know
Mm.
you have a lot of great stories to share. So what we'll do first is for those listeners who don't really know much about you, would you like to talk about where you're originally from, how you got started in the industry? Because I believe you started in acting before you started writing and producing. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was a troublesome kid. I was a troubled and troublesome kid. I didn't have a lot of social skills, and yet I really wanted people's attention, and I didn't know how to get that in a good way, so I ended up getting in a bad way a lot of times. And so to keep me out of trouble, my parents got me into children's musical theater. And so from the age of about 9, I had kind of two jobs all the time, for the rest of my life. So I've always had the thing I'm doing during the day, which was school or work, whatever, and then always rehearsals or classes or something going on in the evening. So I grew up I was born in Southern California, but I grew up mostly in San Jose, California, which is just south of San Francisco, Silicon Valley. And went to high school, did a bunch of performing arts stuff, which allowed me to get into University of Southern California, which is kind of a rich people's school. And my family's not wealthy, but I was able to get some scholarships and stuff like that. And I got into a program that they get a few thousand applications and they only let in 20 or so people per year.
Oh wow.
The Conservatory BFA acting program. And I
Wow.
went through that whole thing, and there was a change in the program itself about halfway through my freshman year that made the program a whole lot less practically useful to its graduates, where they decided to stop being the division of drama of the cinema school and starting to be their own theater school. And so I learned a whole bunch about Moliere and American phonetics, and not a whole lot about actually being a working actor. So I graduated in 94 and I started doing auditions and stuff. And as you'll well know, as a performer yourself, um, doing the job of acting and getting the job of acting are vastly different things. And I think I was pretty good at acting, but I was terrible at being an actor, if
Hmm.
that makes sense. So all of the, getting reps and getting auditions and getting noticed and talking with the right people and doing all of that stuff, I was terrible at it and I hated it. And so I did a couple of years of that. Um, and discovering that I'm an average white dude in a town full of average white dudes who are all going out for the same like two-line day player role somewhere. But this was also like the 90s when the DVD market was still really good. And so a lot of bad films were getting made. And those were most of the films I was auditioning for.
Oh
And
no.
so I'd be reading these sides, sort of the audition things, and they were terrible. And I'm like, this movie is getting made? And so I thought, hey, how about instead of acting in the movie, how about I start writing bad movies? Because I can write as well as this. And so Danny Grossman, who was another average white dude, actor friend of mine, we were best friends in high school and we sort of split to go to college and then we found each other again after college. Um, we started writing screenplays and our first screenplay was about a vampire cop, as most dudes' first screenplays are.
Wow.
And it was terrible, as most screenplays are. And but luckily we could tell it was terrible. And so because we could tell it was terrible, we could also tell about why it was terrible, and we started to work on it. Um, and around that time, I got a job at Universal Studios in sort of the corporate business side. Oh, I was temping first. I was temping for the Universal Studios theme park in
Oh,
a department called Labor Relations, which negotiates and administrates all the union contracts. And so I was doing, I was a secretary basically in a department that's for churro salesmen and ticket sellers and that sort of stuff. Um, and I was there for like a year and a half as a permatemp. And then somebody at the labor relations department in the studio, the movie studio, went on maternity leave or got sick or something, and they ported me down there. So that started 10 years of working at a movie studio, but in the business side of the business, not in
yeah.
the creative side of the business. And in all that time, I had discovered wordplayer.com, which is where you and I met,
Yeah.
way back in the day.
Hmm.
And Ted and Terry, who were such great hosts and such good mentors to so many budding screenwriters. And from that, from a lot of advice and encouragement and actual like gear donations from Terry specifically, we started a thing called SoCal Film Group, a bunch
Yeah.
of work. And with that, we made 50 short films in 5 years, something like that. It was almost one short film a month, and
Wow.
probably half of them suck, but it doesn't matter because we knew we were going to make another one next month. And so that for a lot of us, that was sort of our practical film school of how all the gear works, how all the technology works, and also how something translates from your idea to a page, to an actor's mouth, to an editor, and how it can change each time, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. Um, so that gets me up to about 2005, where Tina Anderson, who was another word player and SoCal Film Group person, she had an idea for a romantic comedy. And I was sort of known as a serial collaborator. I had a lot of different writing partners because I really enjoy the collaborative process. And so she reached out to me and said, I've got this idea. I think it's a rom-com. Do you want to write it with me? And I'm like, I've never done a rom-com before. Sure. This will be like a 6-month exercise. We'll figure out how rom-coms works. It'll be fun.
Yeah.
And around the same time, she mentioned it to Ted and Terry, who were the biggest screenwriters in the world at the time.
Yeah. And I was going
And
to ask, for those who
yeah,
don't know who Ted, Elliott, and Terry Rossio are, can you enlighten our viewers and
Hmm.
listeners who they are, just in case they don't know who they are and why it's a big deal?
yeah. They wrote Shrek and Aladdin and the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. They're a writing team based out of, or they grew up in Orange County in Southern California. They were like high school buddies and always had a hankering for movies and broke in animation.
Hmm.
But like when Shrek was being made for DreamWorks, which was a baby studio at the time, it wasn't, nobody thought it was going to be a big deal. And so it got left alone. And that's how it could be kind of edgy in a way that's not at all offensive, but still has a little bit of spice to it.
Yes.
And that blew up. And so then they got Aladdin. I think it was in that order. It might
Well,
have been the opposite order. Sorry.
I know that Aladdin was 1992 because it just celebrated its 30th anniversary, no, 32nd anniversary, 32nd anniversary.
How
And
can it be 30 years old? You and I are only 25. What the hell?
well, I remember because I remember it came on video when it came out, and Shrek was 2000 because it's actually Shrek. When I was kind of
Mm.
in my teens, that led me to Word Player because if it, so yeah, so Aladdin,
Oh, right.
yeah, so their first film was Little Monsters, and that was how their big spec script sale. Then
Yeah.
they thankfully got a job at Hollywood Studios. And according to Terry's columns, since Aladdin was going through rewrite change, they needed writers. So instead of searching out writers, they got them just within. It's kind of like, well, we already have staff writers, so let's go ahead and use what we got. So I think
Mm,
Ed and Terry auditioned for Aladdin, and they got the job. And they did excellent work on Aladdin, fixing a lot of story hole problems, like just a whole bunch of stuff. So they did that. And then they did other films, and then a whole bunch like Mask of Zorro, Men in Black, gosh, Small Soldiers, the gamut. And then it was up
yeah, right.
until 2000, I think it was 2000, I want to say 2000, 2001. I'm not too sure, but definitely around that time period
Mm,
when it came out, I liked it. I thought, oh, who are the writers that did this? Because I just liked how it was that spin on the fairy tale genre that it was like similar to Terry Pratchett's Discworld series where you had the comedy
yeah.
fused with traditional stories, and it just something like you said, it was edgy, spicy, but appropriate for an entire audience of any age. So I liked
Mm.
it. So I thought, so I just did, like, at the time when Google was the thing starting out, I Googled it, came across the Word Player site, and then yeah, then they did Pirates right after that. So here we are now. Isn't it crazy?
Yeah, right. So
But
in around 2005 or six, when Tina had this idea and brought me on board, she mentioned it to Ted and Terry. And I think Pirates One had just come out and was big, big successful movie. And Ted and Terry, she told them the idea, and they said, "Oh, hey, could we work on this with you?" And we went, "Well, let us think about that." Yes, yes, you can. Yes. And so that started a 2-year process, I think, of developing it on spec with them.
Okay.
And the idea was about a plant lady who works like in a big corporate office, taking care of all the office plants. And she is really shy. She has trouble talking to people, but she talks to her plants all the time. And the movie lets you into the secret world of plants and lets you know that they're all actually sentient all the time and they're talking to each other all the time. They just don't allow us to hear them. So it's a
Yeah.
little bit of a Toy Story thing.
Okay.
And they like her so much, they love her so much that they decide to help hook her up with the handsome janitor.
Oh.
And but then it turns out the janitor's not actually a janitor, he's a thief. But then he's not a thief, he's FBI. But then he's not FBI, he's a thief. But then
Oh.
he's not a thief, he's a janitor.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was kind of based on a great older movie called Charade,
Yeah.
where
Love
the
that.
romantic lead always there, he's always one step ahead, and you don't know what he's really doing.
Yes, that was
And
Cary Grant and Audrey Hepburn.
Audrey Hepburn, yeah, it's a brilliant movie. It really holds up really well. So we developed that for a while. We got to a pretty good place with it, and then Ted and Terry took it out on the town, and everybody passed. Everybody passed, and we think part of it was um, this was in when VFX were still kind of in their infancy compared to today, and we intended it to be a live action film with photorealistic animated plants,
Yeah.
and we didn't say that anywhere in the script. And maybe that wasn't set up by Ted and Terry's agent when it went on the town. And so the animation and the live action places, all the studios were like, "Is this for you? I don't know. Is this mine? Is that, because they had done both animation and live action." And so it was um, there was some confusion. And the last thing you want in the Hollywood system is any confusion at all, because if somebody's confused, they say no.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
but Terry went into Disney, and I think by this time, Pirates 2 had come out and made $1 billion.
It
And he
did.
said to them, "Look, guys, I just made you $1 billion. Set up this project." And they're like, "But it's about a plant lady and her sidekick plants. We're Disney. Could you do a movie about a plant and her sidekick lady?" And he's like, and in the room, he pitched them an entirely new premise. And they said, "Yeah, okay, go do that." And so we got a development deal with Disney based on a thing we had been working on for 2 years being thrown out, and a thing he came up with in 15 minutes being said yes to. But that
Wow.
just tells you how good Terry is, that he could come up with. I think his pitch was, "Okay, so you don't like Dr. Doolittle with plants. How about we do Rear Window with a philodendron?"
Ooh, okay.
So a plant sees a crime, and he has to tell, and he can't move, so he has to tell his plant lady buddy, I just saw this thing, which freaks her out because she didn't know plants can talk, and suddenly she's introduced to the whole world of talking plants, and they have to solve it was a kidnapping of a plant. It was a plant napping, as I recall. It's a long time ago. Um, but then it becomes an adventure about the plant and the plant lady have to go rescue this rare plant that got plant napped.
Wow.
So we worked on that for no. So then Disney said yes, let's do a development deal. And that was Tina and my big break as professional writers. And we were so excited. But in the Hollywood system, from the time they say, yes, we want to make a deal with you to the time you actually start getting paid it used to be 6 months. Now it can be over a year.
Wow. I did not know
Yeah,
that.
it takes a long time. There's a department called Business Affairs, BA, and Business Affairs for a bunch of different reasons, most of which are understandable, just take forever to negotiate anything. And the tricky thing for me was I was still working in the labor relations department at Universal Studios,
Yeah.
and they negotiate union contracts. And the Writers Guild of America contract was coming up because it's every 3 years. And those negotiations were coming up. And I let them know, hey, look, Disney wants to set me up in this deal, which means I'm going to join the union that we're both about to start negotiating against. So they're like, okay, that's fine, but you can't be in our planning sessions anymore, which
Okay.
fair enough.
Yeah.
And so I'm sitting out of those planning sessions, and like 6 or 7 months go by, and finally we're about ready to sign the contract, and I'm about to get paid and become a professional writer, which had been my dream at that point for 10 years. I was so excited for it. And I go into my boss's office, Keith, and I told him, hey, look, I just went and signed the thing at the Writers Guild, sorry, at Disney, and I'm joining the Writers Guild, so I'm gonna quit. Here's my 2 weeks notice. And he's like, no, you're not quitting. And I'm like, what the hell? I've been telling you about this for 6 months. Come on, what's going on? And he's like, no, you're not quitting. We're laying you off.
Oh my gosh.
Means I got 10 years worth of severance
Oh,
because he
okay.
was just such a good dude and they were such kind people and they were happy for me. They were honestly happy for me to be leaving, but also I think they knew a strike was going to come. And
Yeah.
so I think they were like, look, you're going to be broke on your ass. You're quitting a good paying job to go be a striking writer. And that was 2000, and the strike did come, and that was 3 months of striking.
Wow.
Um,
That's a
and
wow.
yeah. So that was a really menschy thing for them to do. So then the strike came, and because of the strike, um, like the momentum of our project didn't really go anywhere.
Mm.
And to be honest, like we were baby writers. Ted and Terry were working on billion-dollar projects. So they didn't have a whole lot of time to spend with us. And it's very possible that Disney said yes to this development deal just because they wanted to keep Ted and Terry happy and they never wanted to make the movie. So there's a lot of stuff that could have been going on that Plant Life never got made. It's still owned by Disney because that's how it works in Hollywood is they buy the copyright.
Mhm.
Um, but that was what kicked me into the creative side of Hollywood. And ever since then, ever since 2007, 2008, I've been bouncing back and forth between being a creative and a businessy guy who facilitates creative people.
Yeah, my gosh.
That's
Wow.
my backstory.
Wow. Oh my gosh, that's a wow. That's both amazing, but sad that the project never got made because I remember seeing the updates on the Wordplay site in development, Steve Barr and Tina Anderson,
Mm,
co-writer. But yeah, I
yeah.
think that's something that people in the industry today, if you were to talk to an average person, they're like, well, why doesn't this get made? And they don't have an understanding of the business side or the quote unquote political side of things. And
Mm,
sometimes it's just like, well, it happened because it just didn't happen. But yeah, but that's great what your company did where instead of you quitting, how because I think most people don't realize if you do get laid off, there is a severance pay. So that's wonderful that
mm,
your previous employer said, you know what, hey, we're gonna lay you off so you're covered, especially with a writer strike happening. And we
yeah.
just recently had our writer strike last year.
Yeah.
And sometimes they can go for months. So that's awesome that the employers had that foresight, just to, just treat you well. So I think that's awesome that they did that part. Seriously.
Yeah, definitely. And the it was really interesting to be undercover creative in the department that their job is to get the best possible deal for the studios, which means they're trying to give the worst possible deal to creative people.
Yeah, which
And yet to have personal relationships of people who, in everything else in their life, they're actually kind, gentle people. And then it was a little Stockholm syndrome from their point of view. It's like, well, if somebody is an engineer who designs a car, they don't get $5 for every time that car is sold in the future. That's their point of view. Where my point of view, a little bit is biased, of course, because I'm a creative and I do want to be paid well. I want to actually make a living at creativity. It's not about mansions and cigars. It's about being able to be a full-time creative person.
yeah,
Um, and so from my point of view, there's an economics term, the tragedy of the commons. Have you heard of the tragedy of the commons?
I'm familiar with it a little bit.
Hmm. So the tragedy of the commons as applies to the Hollywood system, or even outside of Hollywood, the modern screen industry, is that everyone benefits if newer, sometimes younger, but newer, even if they're older, people need to there need to be rungs on the ladder that are lower down than the best of the best. And someone needs to put resources into making content. And so all these creative people get paid to put something in the world that might make its money back and it might not. But you need to have a certain amount of created minutes through the whole process to learn how the process works and become good at it.
Yeah,
But the tragedy of the commons in our business is no one wants to pay for that.
yeah.
Somebody wants somebody else to take all of that risk and then just take the people after they're really experienced and good at their jobs and say, okay, you're ours now.
Mm.
And the back when there was like straight to DVD, back when there was a bunch of other stuff, there was sort of a ladder system for that sort of stuff. And there even used to be a thing called quotes, where a creative person would have a quote of their fee, and each time they got something up, their quote went up by a certain percentage.
Yeah.
That is completely gone now. None of that exists anymore because no one in the Hollywood system or no one in the worldwide film system wants to put resources into training people because
Yeah.
they want somebody else to put the resources into training people, and then they just want to get the benefits of trained people.
Yeah.
And it's tough. Like when I see young people coming up now, who are just now getting into the business, it's so much harder for them than it was for me. And it was so much harder for me than it was for people who were 10 years older than me,
Mhm.
because it's just gotten the expectations on creative people to work for free and to get really, really good without ever being paid to get really good is has gotten harder and harder. The bar has been raised all the time. It's tricky. It is tricky.
It is. I mean, it's also sad too because you have, people who are just trying to have, a living, like you said, not mansions,
Mm,
not this fat cigars. It's just trying
yeah.
to pay your bills and have a little bit of money so you're not broke. So it is sad within the industry how there are people that take advantage of free labor or not. Well, they're trying to get labor for free without
Yeah.
compensation. And yeah, and I think and I'm glad you're telling this because I think people are not aware of it. I think they think, oh, it's great. You just do this, you get your money. Well, it depends on who you're working with. It's not,
Mm,
unfortunately, it's not as cut and dry like it is. So yeah, I think, and so that's a great thing to remember when you do approach the business. You have to be ready for that kind of stuff and to know how you pick and choose your battles, who you do
mm,
business with, or if you want to do business with it. Because I think sometimes, and you know this better than anyone, if you are excited someone's going to buy your script, oh, this is great, or hey, they're going to buy their project, well, then you lose your creative control. And depending on the circumstances, you may get paid and you may not get paid depending on the contract stipulations. So yeah, so I'm glad that you're talking about this because I don't people are aware of that, honestly.
yeah, and I'm not saying it to be a Debbie Downer. I just think forewarned is forearmed. There are times, even now in my life, I'm a journeyman creative person. I work for free all the time still. But I only do it when I've made an educated guess that the benefit I am getting benefits out of it is just not money.
Yeah,
And
there's
so I'm not going to blindly work for free for everybody all the time. I'm working for free for people because I think it's a good risk of my time,
yeah,
you
and that's
know.
actually a topic of that Terry wrote in his article Time Risk, which I love that
Oh
article.
yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think that's the longest wordplay column he wrote. I think because it was a lot to cover. Yeah,
Mhm.
so I think that's important too. Is that, because I sometimes help people with their projects too for free, and I don't get paid anything. It's like
Mhm.
uh it's kind of like, yeah, I'll look at your script and I'll see what needs to be worked on. And I'm still learning myself as a writer. So I'm like, well, maybe try this. And if they want to do it, that's great, but it's their project. I can only offer so much. But yeah, but that's great that you do that though, that you still try to help other people. It's because I think that's how it should be. It shouldn't be,
Mhm.
well, I'm the top dog and you're, it's we're all
Yeah.
people. We,
No.
it's like just love each other and try to be there and just watch out for those toxic types who like to get you for free in a manipulative sense. So that's awesome that
Yeah.
you do
Yeah.
that, Steve. And that also brings us to a topic of, let's just see here. One script I think you mentioned on your Facebook profile, Flirting with Death. So let's talk about development hell in reference to what you did with Plant Life and Flirting with Death. Um, and I think Terry wrote a new column called Shelf Puppies that talks about projects that are languishing development hell. And they're like, have you read that column yet?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's,
Yeah.
I never thought of the analogy before. It's like, that's true. They're just little puppies on a shelf. All they want to do is run in a yard, have fun. So let's try to show a little love to your shelf puppies and just talk about what development hell is and those I think you described it as the three circles to avoid. Like Dante Inferno has the nine circles of hell. So we'll just
Right.
concentrate on the three and let's just use Flirting with Death that you co-wrote with Donnie Grossman. And of course we got the illustration from Plant Life already that you co-wrote with Tina Anderson. So let's
Mm.
talk a little bit about Flirting with Death and for viewers who don't know about that project, let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure, sure. This was a script I wrote literally decades ago as a homework assignment to myself because I wanted to play with some of there are rules of screenwriting, and a lot of times I found myself educating myself by breaking a rule on purpose and learning why the rule is the way the rule it is. And this one was about having a access character into the story, a main character who is not the protagonist, who's actually driving the story. A lot of people do that on accident, and it actually leads to stories that are boring and kind of um, there's not a lot of stakes to them because the person you're following is not the person who's actually cares.
Yeah.
But so I wrote a story about a mortal man whose his time has come to die. But when his time comes to die, he's pushed out of the way of the bus by an angel who then gets hit by the bus, and all time stops, and death appears. Death, personified death, who in this story is a wise and beautiful and compassionate sort of ideal woman. And the man is watching, like, what the hell just happened? Time just stopped. I just got pushed out of the, what the hell is up? And he gets to observe this conversation between this young angel. The angel's only maybe 100,000 years old, which is very, very young for an angel.
Oh
So
yeah.
he's emotionally like an 8-year-old. And he has his first crush ever. And it's on death. He's got a crush on death. And so the mortal gets to watch this as this, young sort of puppy of a guy tries to meet the one of the oldest beings in the universe who actually is quite kind to him. And this happens every couple millions of years. Okay, we get it, it's fine. But you're like, this guy's got a thing he's got to do. You've messed up my schedule. I'm a busy woman. Come on, let's. And so he's like, I'm sorry, I just had to talk with you once, and the only way he could talk with death is because he interrupted this guy's death. Um, so he's like, I'm so okay. I did it once. I'm done. And she turns to the mortal and says, "Okay, I'll just come back for you tomorrow." And
Yeah.
disappear. And so the mortal is like freaked out, but he doesn't know if he was dreaming. He doesn't know, like, well, okay, that was weird. And in the morning, he's taking a shower, and suddenly death shows up, and the angel shows up again, and he's completely nude because he has to be dressed like the person that he's there for. And he escorts this terrified naked mortal out of the bathtub, steps into the bathtub, and slips on soap and breaks his neck. So Death shows up and just like, oh, it's you again. What the hell? Come on. And this happens a few times as we come to realize that this angel is evolving every couple million years. An angel becomes a different kind of angel. And he's developed individual love as opposed to a general broad love for everything. And so he's discovering kind of the nature of love, while the mortal is coming to discover that like death isn't actually very scary. There's a thing that happens, but we don't really know what's up. And eventually he does die and he gets to walk into the, you know, through the tunnel of light with death and this angel who just got a raise. Basically, he got a promotion to being a different kind of angel. Um, so it was a clever script. It was too long. It was 18, 20 pages, something like that. But I was sending it around as like a writing sample for my voice at the time. And there's a school, a conservatory school called the American Film Institute in Los Angeles, which is a pretty well-regarded film school. And they have it's a 3-year program, and in your 3rd year, you make a graduate thesis film, which is sort of your introduction to the industry. And in the year before this whole story happened, the an AFI graduate thesis film won the Oscar for Best Short Film. So
Oh,
they were turning out good content. And word got out. And usually what happens at AFI is it's 3 years. For the first 2 years, you're a generalist. And by the 3rd year, you specialize in writing, directing, or producing. And in this particular year, they had more producers and directors than they had writers. So they put out the word, hey, we're looking for short film scripts for AFI 3rd years to do their stuff. So I sent in this thing just as a writing sample to work on somebody else's idea, one of the directors or producers' idea. And the instructor at AFI said, no, just make this script. Just make Flirting with Death. Do this. And so the producer and the director were like, okay, great, but we want to make some changes to it. Okay, fine, that's kind of the process. And I was eager to learn this process. I was kind of getting an AFI education without having to do AFI. Yay. And I brought in my buddy Danny Grossman, who I already mentioned, I think.
mhm.
And we started working on it. And the notes went from mildly confusing to actively either stupid or evil, and we didn't know why.
Mm,
And we did something like uh uh 12 rewrites in 8 weeks, something like that. It was a lot.
that is.
Um and every time every draft got worse. And we got more and more frustrated with them. They got more and more frustrated with us. And we were in what's colloquially called in the system development hell. We were in hell with these guys. And it turned what had been like we don't really know each other. We don't, but they seemed like okay people to, we thought they were assholes and they thought we were jerks. And oh, and I just swore, I apologize for
You're
that.
fine. No, you're
Uh,
good. It's all good.
and eventually they got so frustrated that they just wrote a draft of their own thing and went and filmed that. And the movie that they made was bad.
Oh,
And I don't say that to be like a jerk to them. It's just they shot a first draft script, and so it was not a great outcome. So it took me a while to figure out, and a few other examples of development problems that what had happened was we did not agree on the movie we were going to make in a
yeah.
few different ways.
Mhm.
And so the three circles of development hell are interpersonal conflict, which we started out not having, but by the end we did have. Disagreeing on who the audience is and what they want, or disagreeing on what the film is really about. And disagreeing on the audience is opens up to a whole lot of different stuff. Like if you don't agree on who the audience is and what they want, you don't agree on pace, you don't agree on tone, you don't agree on genre, you don't agree on lots and lots of different really foundational things. And all of those spur from my point of view, from who are you talking to? Who is your audience? Other people might say, oh, it all spawns from genre, and from genre you figure out your audience. And so you can legitimately say that's all sort of messed up together. But for me, it's I start with who is my audience and what they want.
Yeah.
And we disagreed on that
Oh,
because they didn't have an audience in mind. They wanted to make something that was interesting to the two of them without caring about if anybody else was interested in it.
man.
And then the third thing, which was our real thing, the reason we were in development hell was because we couldn't agree on what the film was really about.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different words to describe that, but I'm going to use the word theme. And people can get a little bit huffy about the word theme because in high school English they're told about theme badly, and they have a sort of itchy academic reaction to
Yeah.
theme. That is this thing that you figure out at the. For me, theme is a tool. Theme is a great diagnostic tool for
Yes.
you to say to yourself, if you understand your theme and you have a creative decision to make, the one that's toward the theme is the one you make. It's
Yeah,
so much makes things so much easier.
it does.
Um, and the theme of this one spurs right from the premise of um, death isn't as scary as we think death is.
Yeah.
Because in this story, death is actually a person who is caring and compassionate and a nice person who's just doing a job. We don't actually say what happens afterwards, but something here is not terrifying. And what our director thought the theme of the movie was death is terrifying.
Mm.
And death might seem nice at first, but it's actually really, really scary, and we should avoid it at all costs.
Like the Grim
Trouble
Reaper
is, he
is
never say that again.
so his thing was like so he wasn't picturing death as in Neil Gaiman's version where death is kind and helpful. So he was visioning like the Grim Reaper with the scythe and the skull. That was his thing he was thinking about? Or is that
Yeah, yeah, that's what we eventually got to. Um, the trouble, what got us into hell, like we could have discussed that and we could have figured out something. We could have maybe found common ground if we had ever talked about it, but we never did. So the he just kept giving notes to and then I'm piecing it all together in hindsight because he never would have said this way, but make death nice at first and scary by the end. He
Yeah.
never even said it that clearly. He just in this moment she should be doing this. In this moment she should be doing this. In this moment she should be doing this. And we're like, that's why? What the And he
Yeah.
could never answer it. And it's because we never actually had that foundational conversation and came to consensus. And so not only was he trying to make a death that was the opposite characterization of death that we wanted to make originally, also the producer was giving notes as well. And he agreed with us that death was a sort of a uh, uh, idealized woman. Like
Yeah.
all of the great things about it, because we're straight men and we like women, and what is the thing that makes a woman ideal to us? And the what turns out is he just really liked doms. And so
Oh.
kept trying to get the woman to be a dominatrix, again, without ever actually saying what it was. He was just give notes about specific beats. And so we're getting all these contradictory beat notes to go from these three different points of view. And if we had discussed the underlying intent behind the notes, we might have just walked away, or we might have been able to actually execute and find some middle ground. But because we never actually talked about the intent, we talked about a bunch of little executable things that didn't make sense because they weren't based on the same foundation. And so it was development hell was the most frustrating thing. And just confusing at the time because we're like, when we first met, you didn't seem stupid, and now you seem stupid, and we don't know why. And they were thinking the same thing about us because we were all just operating off of a different foundational assumption that none of us ever actually talked about. And so that's why, to me, so much of development hell is who is your audience and what do they want? And what is the theme of the story? And if you don't agree on that, stop working. Because
Yes.
anything that's built on those foundations is not going to make sense if you don't agree on those two things.
Yeah, and actually there's a great column. Again, I keep referring to Terry, but he's written wonderful columns.
He's a very smart dude. We should refer to him. Yes.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Like he wrote Notes on Notes, which talks about notes versus speculations. And I
Yeah.
love it because I first heard about that saying when Terry Rossio was on a podcast on I think it's On the Page podcast by scriptwriters, and as he was wanted to talk about the idea about notes versus speculations. And he what he did was say notes is basically an improvement you can do on the story. Speculation is like what you just described of like, what if death was the more of a grim reaper dominatrix versus a more
Yeah.
sweet, genteel woman who's very beautiful? Because that the way how he described it was the face of how you're taking something because in scientific terms, face, I think the way how you described it was that face space, you can either close it or open it, where we
Yeah.
want
Phase space is everything that is possible.
Yes, but we want
So
it
you
to
narrow
follow it.
phase space, less things are
Yes.
possible. Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
because that means it's more specific of like, okay, this is how this character is. So it sounds like the director was doing all these speculations, but confusing them with notes and
Mm.
just completely changing the whole piece and changing the DNA of that story. Where it's like, okay, this is not exactly what it set out to do, where now it's like this hybrid, I'll just say a bastard version of a story that turned out
Right,
to be much
right.
better. Yes, I'm sorry you went through all that because that I think that's the other necessity for time risk of like, you know what, these aren't the people, this is not because I've read that script and it's great. I read it years ago, read it recently.
Mm.
And for viewers who want a better picture of this version of death that Steve's talking about, watch The Sandman on Netflix and look at the characterization how
Mm.
death was. And it's really compassionate. You have a character who's not scary, who's very
Mhm.
compassionate, is what she doesn't sometimes she doesn't like what she has to do. But then I think the sweetest version of that in Sandman was when I think Death visits a Jewish man who's near the end of his death, and she's just very sweet to him, and she's like, "Can I say a prayer?" She said, "Of course." So that's the version that's more close to Steve's vision. So is that accurate in that description of more compassion?
Yeah, absolutely. And very possible it was informed by that because I was a big fan of the comics and I don't have a great chronology sense, so I think I might have read the comics before I wrote this thing.
Yeah.
So I never envisioned her it was to me it was not a like a fanfic
Yeah.
thing.
It,
But it possibly it was. I just didn't realize it at the time.
but it was a love story. It's kind of like you took that character.
Mm.
Like, what if an angel? I think of the script, and I love this quote. I'm trying to pronounce his name. It's Sam, but it's
Nolo qui stickleon.
yes. I'm like, how do you pronounce this? And I'm sometimes good with pronouncing, but I'm like, what is it? And then she was death, of course, and you're the character, the guy. We'll call him the victim in the midst of this. His name is Mort. And was that a reference to Terry Pratchett's Mort, of where the young boy, was that deliberate or was that just like, oh, maybe call him Mort? Was that,
Yeah, it's a little bit of a clammy pun because his name, that character's name was Mort Alvinson, so mortal. Yeah, it's a,
oh,
but also, yeah, Pratchett is the OG. So any comparison I could make to Pratchett, I'd be very welcome to take.
yeah. And it's a wonderful script too. So it's just sad
Mm.
that because of the directors at the time didn't and I think that's something that most people have to realize if it's okay to step away from a project if it's not, especially if you have two opposing points of view. Theme is
Mm.
important. Like you said, it's a diagnostic tool. So if you whoever your collaborators are, if they're not in the same topic, the same page of what you're doing, it's okay to step away, be like, you know what, this isn't working with this group. I don't know if that case if you could take back the material since you already submitted it or uh,
We could have maybe it would have been a dick move to do, so we wouldn't have done that. And I think one of the, like you mentioned time risk before, one of the things I'm honestly very grateful about is that I had this very frustrating thing that it taught me a lot about it, but it was on a short film and the whole process was 3 months.
yeah,
And so I could have been through in a feature film situation that took 7 years to learn the same lesson.
yeah, man.
And so it was really frustrating at the time. It was very confusing at the time. We thought this might be a big break for us. Turned out not to be. But it also was based on something that was only 18, 20 pages long, as opposed to something that was 100 pages long
Yeah.
and could have been much more frustrating and taken a lot more longer time.
And unfortunately, there's several, what would you say, billion tales of development hell from not of several projects over the span of decades in the history of
Yeah.
Hollywood. And because I know people like, oh, why didn't they make a Silver Surfer movie? Well, there's a script. It's in development hell, stuff like
Yeah,
that. And
exactly.
yeah, so I appreciate you sharing light on that because yeah, development hell is real. And I think when people are like, well, why don't movies get made? Well, let's talk about this. So I appreciate you sharing light on those topics for those who don't understand what that is. Then also before I forget, I think I'm checking the time. I don't want to take too much of your time. So I've asked you to select your top five wordplay columns, screenwriting columns. I think they're
Mm,
all by are they all by Terry Rossio that he wrote?
they're all Terry's, yeah. I'm just
Yeah.
going to my
I
notes
thankfully,
here.
and I love your choices too, because that fits perfectly what we talked about. So what's I guess what is your number five column? What's we'll go from I mean they're all great, so we'll just say, what would be your number
Actually, how about we go chronologically because they do kind of
Sure.
uh, work in an order.
Okay, we'll do that.
So
So
my
what
my first one is column 10, which is the audience is listening.
yes, yes.
Um, and one of I used to teach at film school. I used to lecture at film school. And one of the things that is true is almost every movie has a primary relationship. There's usually two characters in a movie that it's the story of that relationship and all the growth because of their relationship and all that sort of stuff. But I think that's a very useful tool, but it's not the primary relationship. It's
Mhm.
the primary relationship in the movie. It's not the primary relationship of the movie.
Yeah.
And I think the primary relationship of the movie is the relationship between the storyteller and the audience.
Yes, absolutely. And I think
Because
people
go ahead. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I was just agreeing with you. I think it's perfect because people sometimes we get so caught up in the story we're telling. It's like you're going to be showing this to an audience, a paying audience who are going to take 2 hours of their time. And if it's not, because I know not personally, but I've heard stories where people just do films without I mean, they do think of an audience, but then it's like, oh, it's kind of like it's more about serving ego versus just
Mm.
telling a good story. And we some I'm sure we can think of some great examples of bad examples not to do that, but it's true, especially content is good where um, I know when people say, we'll just say the F word, just in case for younger viewers watching, is
Yeah.
that imagine if it's I know sometimes when people overuse that word so much, and I think Gene Wilder, before he passed away, that he said that was the one, even though he's used it before in his movies, I
Mm.
think he said that if you use it so much, it loses its power in the sense of that gut punch reaction. And now, depending on the comedic circumstance, take planes, trains, and automobile with Steve Martin. He's gone through hell trying to get back home. And of course, you have Candy as Del Griffith, like the most annoying person you can imagine. And he's, you know, he's at a point where he's so beyond frustrated. All he wants to do is get a rental car. It's not there. So he talks to a sweet lady. He's like, how may I help you? I want to F in this. I want to F in. And that's comedic. So it's great because before that, there was no word. And that just the fact that Steve Martin said the F word alone is how I got R. And then it's like, so do you have your ticket, sir? I threw it away. Oh boy, what? You're effed. So that's and so instead of just saying, so imagine if it was just characters doing it randomly, it loses its power because we
Mm.
have this moment where it's like you see, oh my gosh, he's effing up a storm here. So yeah, so I think if you keep, but I think when audience members excuse me, filmmakers, so do you agree on that? Like knowing when does it become too much, not just swearing, but even, I mean, does that make sense at all? What I'm
Yeah,
trying to
absolutely makes sense to me. And I think for me, a lot of it comes down to a practical tool of we as particularly writers, part of our skill set is understanding the mental viewpoints of all of our characters.
Yes.
Like the antagonist thinks he's the hero of the story. The love interest thinks it's his story, the whatever it happens to be. And so we've in every scene we're flipping back and forth between, okay, what's this character's point of view right now?
Mhm.
And the what we should remind ourselves is that there is an audience watching this, and that should also be a what is their point of view right now?
Yeah.
What do they know? What do they assume? What are they guessing is going to happen? Can we give them what they want, but in a way they didn't expect? Treat the audience as if they're a character in the theory of mind, just the way we treat all the other characters and try to understand what's their point of view every time. Because if
Ex-
we're ignoring the audience, our job is to give the audience a pleasant emotional experience. And if
Right.
we are not setting up expectations and then reversing expectations and doing all of those things, we're not doing our job. We're
exactly.
just sort of whistling in the wind.
And I think Steven Spielberg is I think when he makes movie, he's very conscious of the audience because he himself, I think there's a quote where he's like, I think of the audience because I am the audience, which
Mm,
I think what he refers to that is simply he puts himself in the perspective of an audience member thinking, okay, if this is a movie that I'm watching, if I have no attachments to this film at all, what would I want to see and what are my expectations? Just like we'll take I guess we'll take like, let's use Pirates of the Caribbean, for example. It's kind of like, great, Pirates of the Caribbean based on the Disney ride. What is it that I would like to see? And also versus what kind of expectations can we surprise audience? Because surprise is good too. So if it's kind
mm,
of like, oh, this is going to happen. But then if you're aware of the storyteller of your audience, is like, wait a second, what if we flip it? Like I remember the reaction in the theater in Pirates of the Caribbean #1, The Curse of Black Pearl, when Jack is stabbed by Barbossa. There's this big shock, thinking, "Oh my gosh, Jack is going to be killed." And of course, Jack steps into the moonlight and I think there was some like, what? Jack's skeletal? But then it's great because you see him pull a coin. And if you watch the movie several times, you'll realize that Jack, at one point, while trying to convince Barbossa to just sail out to Commodore Norrington's ship, hoping that he'll just sail, but Barbossa's smart, he'll go underneath the water. It's like, oh, not to the boats. And then, of course, he takes that gold medallion as insurance.
mm.
Uh, yeah, so it's perfectly planned, knowing like, okay, what are the expectations? What's the audience going to anticipate? Then how can we surprise them? And it's a wonderful moment. It's a big cheer. It's like couldn't resist, mate. And then they start the skeletal sword fight. So, do you think that's a good example of the
I think
audience?
that's a great example. Yeah, exactly. And there's even something more foundational than that of there were a couple of writers who took passes at Pirates of the Caribbean before Ted and Terry did, and they were
Yes.
doing shows about pirates in
Mhm.
the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And then Terry and Terry, and then they're not working, they're not getting progress, anything like that. And then Terry and Terry go on the ride, and the ride has a bunch of skeletons and stuff
Yes.
behaving as if they're alive. And they're like, that's not in any of this, any of the previous work.
Mhm.
And so what you need is this. This is what people on the ride want to see. That's what they're expecting. So let's give them what they expect. And then they get to have all the play about, okay, if you had undead pirates, what could you do? And that's so much of the joy of that movie is undead pirates.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. And both the and also how it's what was it? The Jeffrey Rush's best monologue written by Ted and Terry of you best start believing in ghost stories, Miss Turner, you're in one, and talks about
You're in one as he
and it's
moves
not
into the light. That's so good.
yeah, so again, brilliant writing on their part. And now let's talk about what's your next column that you like by
My next one is number 13, The Big Finish.
yes.
The point that Terry makes much more eloquently than I can, so people should just go read it, is that endings need to be four things all at the same time. They have to be decisive, set up, inevitable, but unexpected. So decisive means it ends. There is a resolution as opposed to just something happens. I don't know. They have to be set up, which means they can't just come out of the blue. It can't be cheating. There has to be seeds that were planted earlier that now come to fruit. It has to be inevitable, but it's got to be inevitable in hindsight because if it's predictable, it's not exciting. It's not fun because it also has to be unexpected and unpredictable. And finding something that's both inevitable and unexpected is magic. It's really, really hard, but it just means you need to plant seeds and then hide the fact that you're planting seeds by
Yes.
making those seeds look like something else. They look like jokes, or they look like a solution to a different problem, or something like that, or they're the B story, the subplot, or something. But then when it finally everything comes together, that gives you this great emotional cathartic experience of, oh, of course that's how that had to go. That's so great. And I think audiences, again, for me, a lot of it's about audience reaction. Um, Audiences remember their final emotion
Yes.
more than they remember the whole thing. So
Yes.
whatever the final emotion is, they're going to, in their memory, paint the entire movie on that final emotion. And if their final emotion is kind of disappointed, they'll think the whole movie was disappointing, even if they loved it for 90% of it. But if that final emotion is absolutely nailed, the whole movie will feel better in their memory, and they might want to go back and see it again. So
Yeah,
yeah, the ending is so important. A
yeah.
lot of people start at they have an idea and they just start working forward. A lot of times they never get to the ending. But for me, I don't start a project unless I can figure out, okay, what's the killer, emotionally cathartic, fulfilling ending. If I can't figure that out based on the basic premise, I don't start working yet because it's not a story yet.
Yeah, exactly. Because some people, I think, I'll use Chris Sanders, writer, filmmaker, director, as an example.
Mm,
And his interviews that Chris Sanders did, and Chris Sanders, for those who don't know who he is, he just recently did The Wild Robot at DreamWorks,
mm,
and he was responsible of creating the character Stitch for Lilo and Stitch. Then he and Dean DeBlois, who also co-write and direct Lilo and Stitch. They also did How to Train Your Dragon, the first one. Then Dean DeBlois went on to do the other ones. But Chris Sanders always said he likes to start at the end of a film, knowing how's it going to end, then kind of reverse engineer of like, how do we
mm,
get to that point? So just to use How to Train Your Dragon as a quick example, we see everyone's on dragons, they're flying, it's great. But then how do we get to that point? Well, let's have them and there's more to it, and there's some great interviews with Chris Sanders being more details about it. But it's like, okay, if we're going to have the ending where everyone's embraced dragons, so naturally we'll start at the beginning of this rivalry between dragons and humans until Hiccup befriends a dragon, develops a friendship, which causes the drama between trying to keep it secret. And of course, his dad, all he wants his son Hiccup to be is a dragon slayer, but of course, Jacob can't do that, and that creates the tension, and that hopefully brings the resolution to. So yeah. So do you think that's a good example there, just for one?
yeah, exactly right. Figuring out the what is that amazing moment, and then okay, what does the audience have to understand for that moment to hit as impactfully, emotionally impactfully as it can. And quite often it means I have to start at the opposite of that moment somewhere else
Yeah.
and then work our way through to set up all of the foundations in order to pay off this moment. You can think of an ending as a TNT stick, piece of dynamite exploding,
Yeah.
and then the entire movie is about fuse.
Hmm.
What is the fuse that gets us to that explosion? Because the explosion is the point.
Yeah, and a few other examples, just very quickly. I when I first read the the Big Finish. I had grown up watching Darby O'Gill and the Little People, a Disney film from the 1960s. Since I'm
Nice.
part Irish, that was a tradition. You watch this film. And of course, I grew up loving it, watching it. So when I read The Big Finish and I saw Terry also loving it, I was like, okay, this is awesome. And just using the example of that film, and I was like,
Mhm.
yeah, because if for those who haven't seen Darby O'Gill and the Little People, watch it. And also be sure to read Terry's column, The Big Finish as well. So that way you can see the details of that. And then, of course, Aladdin, Jafar becoming the genie or being tricked into genie, which Terry covers
Mm.
in his columns. So definitely check those out too. But now let's go on to your next column. So what's your next favorite column that you like?
The next one for me is points for style. I think it's column 23.
Okay.
And there's every screenplay has to do multiple things. And even at very late stages, not only is it a technical document in order to make a film, sort of the recipe for a film, it's also a reading document, a sales document
Mhm.
that someone can read it and go, I understand the intentions of the story, I understand the emotions of the story. And in the best of words, I'm feeling the emotions the audience is going to feel. I'm going to have the same, the very best screenplays replicate the audience experience for the reader and gives them the same emotional and intellectual journey that the audience would have, and the audience yet has the all of the benefits of all of the grammar of cinema, of editing and performance and score and costuming and production design, all that sort of stuff. And a screenplay just has a relatively few number of words on a page, which is really, really hard. And so how we convey all of that stuff is through our stylistics.
Mhm.
How do you put together sentences? What sort of words to choose? How do you convey to the reader? How do you get the reader to forget that they're reading symbols on a page and start watching a movie in their head?
Mhm.
And anything you can do to get them into that mental space is great. And anything that knocks them out of that space is bad.
Yes.
So anytime a reader is confused about what the intent of the line is, anytime the sentence is too complicated, has too many clauses, or repeats back on itself, anytime, even stuff like grammar, screenplays aren't as grammatically pure as like a thesis document or an English essay or something like that. But it's not about getting good marks. It's about not kicking your reader out of the script.
Yeah.
And readers who don't understand grammar aren't going to be bugged by it, but most professional readers are grammarians. And
Yeah.
so that's a reason it's not about getting the right mark and being a grammar Nazi. It's about letting your reader have a smooth, engaging experience, as opposed to starting to think about where commas should go or whatever, you
Yeah,
know?
and that actually reminds me of a couple of things. I think at one point back on the Wordplay forums message board, I think at one point did you ask, I think it was Terry, like, how do you write with zip, like the zippiness of stuff? And you remember his replies? And also there's some great ones too in Terry's column points per style, where again, for viewers who are interested in screenwriting, check it out. But do you remember the response of that writing with Zip and Terry's advice to you through the wordplay message
I
board?
don't. Yeah, please remind me.
Well, I think I remember a little bit. I think it was simply what you stated, like structuring your sentences. And I can always go back after this interview and look for them. But it's just I know in the column itself, Terry referenced Shane Black, how he likes to use we call them Shane Blackisms now. And Shane Black, of course, wrote Lethal Weapon, The Long Kiss Goodnight, and he did Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. He also directed Iron Man
Iron
3
Man.
and The Predator.
Mm,
So, and I think because I think the worst thing you can get is just have a blocked paragraph that's so
mm.
dense you can't get through it, and it can have very important information. But if you're a reader, and of course, nobody likes to read the long paragraphs, so I think it's good to put them what 5, 6 lines or 7 at the max, but that's it. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And in my personal style, unless I'm doing something that's intended to be really slow, like a slow creep down a hallway for a horror movie, I'll do 3 lines max in a
Yeah.
paragraph. Because every time a paragraph changing into a new paragraph implies a cut
Hmm.
editorially.
Yeah.
And you should never say like editorial language or camera language, but you should imply the cinematic experience as closely as you can.
Exactly. And there's actually another great example that Terry did on the podcast, on the page podcast, where
Mm,
the way how you say something can affect the reader too. I forget exactly, but I'll paraphrase it. So he used an example and you can use it for dialogue too, where imagine if you take a sentence of like, um, there's a glowing vampire's eyes through a rain-soaked window. So that's just like duh, 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 duh. But then how he did it was that have the image that you want to be seen, have that as your landing image. So I think if we were to revise it, it's like through the rain-soaked window, the vampire's eyes glowed. And that's just
yeah.
so better because it's not just you're not it's not like you're reading refrigerator manual instructions, put AAA. It's dramatic too. And I think when people are writing, it's not just dialogue, but action descriptions. I would go far to say treat it like dialogue. And I know that's
Mm,
kind of a extreme thing, but what I mean by that is imagine you have a person assigned to read the descriptions. How are they going to say it? And it's based on how you construct those descriptions. So imagine if we started with that first sentence, oh, the glowing vampire's eyes through the rain-soaked window versus through the rain-soaked window, the vampire's eyes glowed. And that's you
yeah.
see how it's more interesting. It's like, and you can visualize it too. And I'm not describing shots or anything like that. It's simply, oh, so imagine if we had a camera maybe closing in, or maybe we just
Mm.
want to hold, or maybe we should pull back and get the creepiness. What do you think about that? That example?
I think that's a brilliant example, and it makes me think about jokes. A
Yeah.
lot of really good sentences have the format of a joke, which is that the most important thing is the punchline at the end.
Yes.
And so in your first example, which is less effective, it feels like the most important thing is a window. The most important thing is not a window. The most important thing is the glowing eye. And so take the thing that's most important, stick it on the end, and that solves half of your problems for yourselves. There's also a thing that happens like a lot of writers come from short stories or novels, prose into screenwriting. And there's a thing you can write in novels that would be fine, which is non-chronological sentences.
Mhm.
So like uh she opened the door after tying her robe closed.
Mhm.
Well, that would work in a novel, sure. But it's not what you would see on screen because it's out of order in time. So she ties her rose closed and then opens the door. And a reader, could understand that point. They could watch that scene in their head with that first version. It would just have to work at it. It would take a little bit of mental energy to reorder the sentence themselves in order to watch the scene in their head. But our job is kind of to make the readers not have to work that hard.
Exactly. Exactly. And then also,
And one of the other things is a lot of readers are very, very smart, but professional readers are overworked like crazy because
Mhm.
staffs are half the size that they used to be. And so I tend to write at like a high schooler's vocabulary level
Mhm.
and sentence structure level. It's simple sentences, simple words, and it's not because I think they're dumb, it's because I think they're distracted.
Yeah.
And so I want even a distracted reader to be able to very clearly understand my intent.
Exactly. And also, speaking of punchline, you also have done stand-up comedy, so you actually know how that works, having done
Mm.
comedy self of, okay, here's how I want the joke to land on this punchline. So you know all that.
Yeah, totally, totally. And stand up is very much about misdirection. You set up an expectation and then you misdirect the expectation. And great scenes, whether they're comedy scenes or horror scenes or action scenes or love scenes, they the audience is being entertained by thinking you're going one way and then it goes another way. And you can't a lot of people focus on the misdirection, but really the skill of that is in the setup, giving the
Yes.
expectation in the first place.
And I
Because
actually
then the
thought of,
misdirection is easy.
and I thought of a good example. Do you remember the show Fresh Prince of Bel-Air with Will Smith? Uh,
Mhm.
so there's this episode where I think it's the late James Avery, who plays Mr. Banks. You have Carlton Banks and Will. They're supposed to go on this trip or something like that. And of course, they get stuck in the middle of nowhere, this wilderness, and they're stuck in a cave. And somehow they come across this duffel bag full of money, but it's useless, so there's no money. So of course, Carlton, he's off this side, and it's kind of like they're opening up to each other, like it's kind of like bearing your soul. So I remember there's this joke where Carlton Banks, he's very serious. He's like, for a long time, it gave me nightmares. Having to witness an injustice like that, I could still see him taunting him. It just shows you how cruel this world can be. Silly rabbit, tricks are for kids. Like, why then just give him a bowl of cereal? So, because you're thinking it's like, oh my gosh, what he's talking about. And then you get the punchline. It's just, he's so hung up on the rabbit not getting a bowl of trick cereal. So is that kind of
Yeah,
like what I'm
exactly.
talking about with that?
Yeah, exactly. You're leading the audience down a path, or you're saying, "Hey, come and stand on this beautiful rug. Look at how nice the rug is. It's such a solid rug," in order to then pull the rug out from under them. And if you do that in a fair way and you do that in a good-hearted way, it's really entertaining as opposed to feeling like you just got cheated.
Exactly. Yeah. So again,
Yeah.
it's also again knowing your audience, knowing the audience you're playing towards. Now let's go on to your next. I think are we on column? Is it your fourth column that you
This is
create?
my fourth.
Okay.
Oh, it's the task.
Yes.
Column 30, the task. And I think you might see that I'm getting all of the columns are really great.
Mhm.
I'd recommend anybody who's at all interested in screenwriting reads all the columns. But you might see that there's a pattern in mine of the practical tools, practical narrative tools. And this is the column is called the task. And I use um the idea of goal versus task all of the time, both in my own writing and when I do professional dramaturgy. Um, the a goal a character, what they're trying to achieve ultimately by the end of the story needs to be universally positive, something that almost anyone in the world will get and appreciate and understand and empathize with. And if you make that true, then you can give the worst possible tasks, the most difficult, challenging, unpleasant things that have to be done in order to achieve the goal. If you don't make that goal clear, or if it's not universally positive, all of this stuff doesn't really matter,
Exactly.
but you still need to have it. And so, an example I think Terry uses in his column is The Wizard of Oz, which is
Yes.
Dorothy wants to get home. Home is universal positive for almost everybody. Even if you define home differently than I would, you still have a concept of home that is positive. Dorothy wants to get home because that's established so well. She can do a series of really horrible experiences, but the audience will keep going with her because they get home.
Yeah.
And once you've got that goal, then you can start to focus on tasks, which is giving your characters something always in a scene by scene basis that they are actively trying to achieve.
Hmm.
Because so many early screenplays are about people sort of sitting around and not really wanting anything, and stuff happens to them and they kind of react to it, and then the end. And they're dull. They're just dull. And people write them because I think they're trying to convey reality, but
Hmm.
people go to the movies because they live in reality. They want something else. And so give your characters something active that they're trying to achieve in every scene. And that thing, that task can be something unpleasant, morally challenging, icky, whatever, if you've also given them a goal, which is a universal good. And you can see how the task is feeding toward the goal.
Right, and I agree. And I can think of two great examples. The first one is Back to the Future. Marty McFly accidentally gets sent back to the 1955, and he's trying to get home, just like Dorothy. But it's brilliant the way how directors and writer Bob Zemeckis and Bob Gale wrote that, because they went through different drafts. I think at one point there was one version where I think Bob Zemeckis was going to have Marty McFly in a refrigerator at a nuclear testing site because it said because some or the machine or whatever the time machine was. So that was their first concept, and I think this is also true if you're doing a task. Kind of look what's the good idea versus the great idea. So imagine if we would have had just that, it would have been okay. But then they thought, well, what if the time machine had wheel? And of course, it's just the development process. The Bob Zemeckis and Bob Gale did was like, well, what if we had wheels? Okay, great. And then of course it moves. So it's not like the H.G. Wells time machine where it's just stands still and time changes.
That's
So
right, right.
yeah, and I saw that uh so when you watch Back to the Future, it's exciting because it's great. There's the ticking clock, physical ticking clock of when the lightning has to strike. And of course, it's powered by gas, but it needs, the extra charge of plutonium. The only way to get that is through lightning. And again, planting your setup, paying it off. So it's brilliant. And that's one example of task of and what happened, and the consequences if you don't. I think the second example would be The Lord of the Rings. And this is actually, it was through that column that actually got me interested of wanting to watch the Peter Jackson's version of Lord of the Rings, believe it or not, from that
Right.
column. Well, because I knew about Lord of the Rings somewhat. I knew as a kid from watching an animated version of The Hobbit, and there was this Nickelodeon TV show called David the Gnomes or something, or David the Gnome, and it had trolls that would turn to stone in the sunlight. But the way how Terry
Mhm.
described the task, because first he was going to use Rocky, he thought, no, let's use Lord of the Rings. And when he described it, Frodo is tasked with this ring. Otherwise, if he doesn't bring it to Mount Doom, all it's going to be the end of Middle Earth, covered in eternal darkness. And then you have this character who, he's not equipped at all. So it's really courageous that with the Fellowship, have to. So yeah, so it was because that example.
Mhm.
That's how I watched Lord of the Rings, but also that's how I learned about a little bit about New Zealand too. So if it wasn't for Terry using that example, so again, it's brilliant column that he wrote, and it's emphasized perfectly a task. I mean, would you think so, Steve?
Yeah, definitely. And that, like, one of the great points he makes in the thing is, which you've alluded to, is if you as a creative come up with a really great task, this might then help design the character for the task. Because quite often you want to design a character that is absolutely inappropriate for that task, because then you have conflict, then you have character growth, then you have all these other things. And so all of it can be built. That can be one of the foundations. That can be one of your starting points is, ooh, I've just discovered I want to do a thing where there's a person who has to play a rock and roll song at a 1955 sock hop in order to get his parents when they're still young to fall in love with each other. And that's the only way he can get home. That specificity becomes amazing. So it's not just, oh, person has to run race really fast or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's a great scene too. Love that scene from Back to the Future.
Mm.
Now let's go to your fifth column. So what's your fifth one that you love?
My fifth one is column number 34. It's called Throw in the Towel.
All right. And
And it is I remember reading this column and I actually I don't want to talk all the way through the column because it's a column that should be read to experience.
yes.
Your people watching this, if they haven't read the column, they should just go read it. Like
Yes.
pause right now, go read the column, then come back for this.
Exactly.
Um, because Terry writes it being aware of who his audience is. We keep coming back to who is your audience and what they want from you. And I remember reading that column for the first time, having like so many creative people in difficult creative endeavors, thinking to myself, maybe I'm the wrong guy. Maybe
Mm,
this isn't my thing. Maybe I shouldn't be doing, maybe I'm wasting my time. Maybe my life would be better if I quit. Maybe my family would get more from me if I quit. And he goes through that, and it's an absolute gut punch because he expresses the thing that happens inside the minds of so many creative people.
yeah,
And it's really challenging, and it's an emotional read,
it is.
particularly for somebody who's felt those emotions themselves. And then it gives a little tiny glimmer of hope at the end, but that's all it is, you
Yeah.
know? And I do think, I've been holding on by my fingernails in creative industries for 30 years now.
Mm,
And I'm a moderately competent guy in a
mm,
few different things. And so that's how I've been able to do this instead of have a day job for most of my life. But there are I know a lot of people who are more talented than me who have failed and quit. And I know some people who are less talented than me who are more successful than I am.
yeah.
And to and I probably shouldn't say talent because I'm only moderately talented. I just work really hard.
Yeah, same here.
And that's a factor in it. Um, but the if anybody goes into this, the creative industries thinking that it's a meritocracy, they're going to get their heart broken.
Yeah,
It's not, and you're not going to get treated fair. And yet that also is not an excuse for you to be unfair to other people.
exactly. Yeah.
The trick you should do is find other people that share your values and your tastes, but have different skills than you have. And then together you can go make great stuff. But also there are people, honestly, and I say this with the greatest compassion and feeling, who should quit
Yeah.
because they don't have the thing. And the trouble is, and I've had this myself, when I was in acting school, one of my acting professors said, acting isn't for everybody to
Mm.
me. And in my head, I'm like, every actor has this story. Yay, this means I'm real. And actually, it turns out he was right,
Oh no, oh no.
you know? Because I'm not a professional actor. I get every once in a while someone asks me to act in their thing because I can do this on camera, but this is all I can do. This is the thing I do. And so me going auditions and showing my rage is not a way that I'm ever going to get work. People reach out to me because they want this thing for a little bit on screen. Okay, great. And so he was right. And if I had listened to him and transitioned into writing and producing, which is what I do professionally now, I could have started my that journey 3 years earlier and saved a lot of money from going to a acting program that ended up not being that valuable to me. But because there's a romanticism to a creative being told they should quit and then choosing not to quit, the ones who actually should quit kind of sometimes get led down a bad path.
Yeah.
And so in that column, there's actually almost a checklist. It's not quite as tick boxy as this, but
Mhm.
there's a bunch of it. Think about this thing. Do you have all of these things? If you don't have these things, or if you're not objective enough about yourself to know whether you have these things, that probably means you don't have the thing.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe you should consider doing something that's going to be more fulfilling to you. Now, with that said, there's a bunch of people who are hobbyist writers and
Mhm.
hobbyist filmmakers and hobbyist people who get real value out of it personally, but not professionally. I am not saying they should quit
Yeah.
at all. If the act of doing this, if you do community theater and you love it and it gives you a community around you that you really enjoy being with and it lets you stretch those creative muscles and yet you know it's never going to get you a mansion and a yacht, but you love it, do it. Absolutely do it.
Yeah.
Because then you're probably more realistic about it than somebody who comes out to Hollywood and gets off the bus and says, "Where do I go to get my Oscar?" Not going
Yeah.
to happen. It's not going
No,
to happen.
and it's just like the singers, like singers professionally. And like we've seen like American Idol, and what's interesting is that, there's some people like, oh, I'm gonna be the best singer, but then something happens where it's like, no, you're not. For me, I'm never gonna be Josh Groban. I'll just stick to karaoke and little theater. That's all I know I'll do.
Sure.
But there's
Yeah,
some,
great.
but there's some that have the blindness of thinking they're the best. But when it comes to improvement, and I think ego is a part of it too, or talent
Mm.
is help. Because I think I remember in a column, again, another column that Terry Rossio referenced, I think when he was starting out in writing, I think he went to his English professor and said, "Hey, how do you make stories good?" And I think she alluded to, well, maybe, I think she said, well, I'm trying to remember exactly, but it's along the lines of like, "Oh, you're not that good." Now, imagine if he would have listened to that voice. We want to be here, honestly. So
Right.
there
Yeah,
is,
totally.
so I think it just takes prudence to know, like, okay, this person is full of crap. I'm going to
Mm.
keep doing what I need doing. But if you have no improvements, and if it's like you're just going in circles, then you have to think maybe I should look for an alternate venue. So I do agree with you absolutely.
Mm. Mhm.
And it's funny because that was a topic of my show I just did. It's about a woman who wants to be a singer, but she thinks she's awesome. But then, of course, she gets the reality check of like, no, you're not. And then, of course, she gets the aid of magical candy to act and sing better. But yeah, but so I think if people have to really look at themselves, and it's not being mean, it's like, okay, I'm gonna try it. I'm gonna give it my best shot. But if there's no improvements, then I have to consider to maybe pursue something else professionally and creatively.
Mm. Yeah, totally. And I think for me, we get a little bit into theory of mind because none of us actually knows how anybody else thinks.
Yeah,
We're making assumptions about that sort of thing. But in my personal process of learning to become better, and I'm pretty good at this now, I'm not a master at it. Um, the the pattern that I see is someone who cannot see any flaws in their creative output
oh yeah,
and then get frustrated that other people don't recognize that they are making flawless content.
yeah,
Um, they are incapable of changing and improving. The people I know who are really, really good at it, people who are way better than me at it, are ones who can see nothing but the flaws,
yeah,
you know? And they're uh like I listened to Script Notes, which is Craig Mazin and John August.
yes,
And the Craig Mazins who's done like he came up doing a bunch of mediocre comedies and then he did Chernobyl and The Last of Us and they are amazing masterpieces. And the biggest critic of Craig Mazin's writing is Craig frickin' Mazin.
yeah,
And that's why he's so good in a way that's actually probably a little bit unhealthy. Like he needs to learn to love himself a little bit more. But the there's also the danger there of romanticizing
Mm.
self-harm,
Yep.
emotional self-harm, which I'm not trying to do.
Yeah.
But like when I think about that first script that I wrote with Danny Grossman, which was bad, we could tell it was bad.
Hmm.
And that's how that the first thing, if the oh, this reminds me, there's an amazing thing online called the his name is Ira Glass. He does a podcast called This American Life, but he was being interviewed by somebody else.
Oh.
And he just off the top of his head talked about The Gap.
Mhm.
And The Gap is this brilliant little 30-second piece of audio that people have liked so much they've done whole like word animations and all sorts of stuff to go with it. And The Gap is creative people have this idea, this beautiful thing in their head that they're trying to achieve, and then they execute something that's not as good.
Yeah.
And they recognize that it's not as good.
Mhm.
And they get frustrated because it's not as good as the thing that their taste tells them is good.
Yeah.
And that's when a lot of people quit.
Hmm.
But in the first X number of years of you doing this, in the first 10,000 hours of your practice, the fact that your skill set doesn't match your taste is great. You want that because if you first start doing a thing and you're making things that match your taste, that just means your taste isn't very good.
Yeah.
You know, you want to have excellent taste that is difficult to achieve, and then you want to be building that skill set to finally, hopefully, one day meet your taste. Or actually, as soon as your skill set meets your taste, you stop growing. So
Exactly.
hopefully, your taste gets better as you go, and your skill
Yes.
set is always chasing the taste. And
Yeah.
that's where I think all of us creatives should be trying to achieve. And so, if ever you make it, you output a thing that's not as good as you hoped it would be, that's a good sign because you know it's now, if you can identify what is it that's not right,
Mhm.
you know the next thing you need to learn.
Exactly. And that's actually two columns that Terry covered crap plus one with Ted Elliott, and then he
Yeah.
did targeting. So as long as you have your target, just have your target, know what you want. So, and just try to get there, even if it's just little baby steps at a time, but as long as you're making that progress. So yeah, so
Mm.
absolutely, I agree 100%.
Totally
And
right.
and I'm just now looking at the time. So
Oh
before
wow, we've been going for a while.
yeah, sometimes that happens. So we just talk like, oh wow. But before we end, I just want to talk a little bit about your experience working on Pete's Dragon. Because that was a 2016 remake by Disney, directed by David Lowery, and he co-wrote it, based on the 1970s musical starring Mickey Rooney and I think Helen Reddy also. And so I want to talk about that experience because you are a great actor because the role that you had as Deputy Smalls always got a laugh. And also, yeah, so would you talk about that experience a little bit and also just living in New Zealand compared to,
Mm.
from originally being from America to living in New Zealand for how many years is it? 7 or something like
It's
that?
coming up in 15 years now.
Oh, 15. Oh my gosh, sorry, it's 15.
Yeah.
So yes, Cope
Yeah.
would like to talk about that as
Okay, sure. I'll start with New Zealand. That'll get me to Pete's, I think.
okay, perfect, perfect.
Um, uh, we moved here. My wife, I've been married for 27 years. My wife got invited to study at the veterinary school in New Zealand in 2010. And New Zealand has one of the five, actually, there's only five vet schools outside of America that America recognizes, and New Zealand is one of them. It's one of the top 20 vet schools in the world. And so that was 2010, and it's a 5-year program. So we moved out here in 2010. We also had only ever seen the Lord of the Rings movies, and another word player had made a movie, a New Zealander had made a movie called Black Sheep, which was about sheep that start killing
Yes,
people.
yes, yes.
So that's all we had seen, and yet we came out here on an adventure, and the idea, it's a 5-year program because it's kind of a master's and a doctorate all at once. And the idea was that she'd become a vet, we'd move back to Los Angeles, I'd get back into the movie making system, and she could sell horse tranquilizers to Lindsay Lohan. That was the plan. And by the time the 5 years was up in 2015, we had fallen in love with New Zealand. It's an amazing, amazing country. It's My mom was English and she came and visited at some point. And she said it reminded her of England in the 50s, except they have modern technology and they're not afraid of brown people or gay people. And that describes it really well. That describes it really well.
Oh,
Um, and so the quality of life here is really great. The politics are not completely crazy. They're a little bit crazy, but not as weird as American politics have gotten.
yeah.
And we're really enjoying it. So it's 15 years now. Um, but also I'm now middle-aged white dude with an American accent who doesn't freeze up on camera. Like I
Oh,
don't have a lot of range, honestly. I'm not a great actor, but I can, I don't bump into the furniture and I remember my lines. So every once in a while, I get put into something. And an audition came around for Pete's Dragon, and they wanted my demo, and the American accent helped. And so I auditioned against some better actors than me, but they were Kiwis putting on an American accent.
mhm.
And in the audition with David Lowery, he was in the first callback. A lot of times for a big Hollywood show, there's going to be 6 or 7 callbacks,
Yes.
and especially for a major role, which Deputy Smalls wasn't. But he was at the first callback. I didn't expect him to be there, and it was that scene. It's actually in the if you want to look at the trailer, if you haven't seen the movie, there's a scene where the deputy's in a cop car with the sheriff Isaiah Whitlock, who's an excellent actor.
Yes.
Um, and I yelled, "Dragon! There's a dragon!" And that was the audition scene. It's only like 3 lines, but that's Deputy Smalls only had maybe 8 lines, 10 lines in the whole movie. Um, and I did it straight once, and then he said, "Well, just riff on a little bit." And I started making Khaleesi jokes. I started making Marvel comic book jokes. I started just making jokes. There's a dragon. Someone called the Khaleesi, and he laughed at that. And I think because he laughed at that, um, I think that's why I was cast in it.
Oh,
And then it became the easiest and most fun job I've ever had because I didn't have anything to do. They shot in a little town in the far south of well, actually I shot in 2 different locations. One up in a hospital set that was near one of the 2 main cities, Auckland or Wellington. I don't honestly remember where it was. And then a month down in a little tiny town called Gore, which is very far south in New Zealand. And New Zealand is a long north-south country. So the top is kind of where you start to think of the South Pacific. Sandy beaches, lots of sun, it's hot, not quite coconut weather yet, but it's getting close to it. And the bottom is the closest occupied landmass to Antarctica. And
whoa.
you can tell it's very, very cold down there.
Wow.
And we were down there, and it was an ex logging mill that they were using as a big set. And I got to be down there for a month, even though I was only ever on set like 9 days that month. So I just got to hang out with a bunch of great, talented filmmakers and actors. Got to, eat lunch and dinner with Isaiah a lot, and he's a really, really interesting guy. Done a lot of Spike Lee shows, was on The Wire, just an amazing dude. And then, working with Bryce Dallas Howard, and unfortunately, I never got to be on set. I was never in a scene with Robert Redford.
Ah,
But everything that I heard about him was he was just a decent dude who was there to do his work. Like he doesn't have to focus on doing the work anymore. So he's just there being a decent dude and helping other people be good at what their jobs.
that's awesome.
And Bryce, like every once in a while, Bryce is cast as a femme fatale or as a uh uh romantic lead or whatever. Bryce is the biggest mother.
Aw.
She just has so much mom energy. She is such a loving, caring, gentle person that she was making sure we had hot soup all the time. She was looking after everybody. It was so
Wow.
cool to hang out with her. Like I'm 2 decades older than her and she was my mom on set.
Wow.
It was awesome. And so yeah, it was just a great experience. Also watching the New Zealand cruise.
Mhm.
I've worked in the Hollywood system, both the studio and the indie Hollywood system, which is a lot of the same people but different businesses. And I've worked in the Chinese film system and I've worked in the New Zealand film system. And the New Zealand crews are pound for pound the best crews I've ever worked with at all. Um, And part of it is because they don't have 100 years of labor and management trying to screw each other over.
Yeah.
And so, like in the LA system, if there's a ladder that needs to get moved because it's in the way or it's a safety danger, and you move the ladder and you're not part of the ladder moving union, you get fired.
Yeah. That's really
Because, and there's good reasons for that. That's not the unions being dicks about it. It's because if management can pay the least paid person to do all the work, they're just going to get the least skilled, least paid person. And
okay.
so the unions need to protect their jobs by saying no one but us are allowed to do our jobs. So there's a reason for that. But that bad faith thing hasn't happened in New Zealand yet.
Good.
And so if someone needs to move a ladder, somebody moves the ladder. It might be the producer.
Hmm.
It might be the director. People help each other. People carry sag grabs. People wrap cables. Everybody knows how to do most of the jobs, and so it leads to a really efficient and good-natured thing because everybody's there kind of to help each other, and it's just a joy to work here in the New Zealand system. Come
Yeah.
on down, dude. Come make
Oh,
a film here.
oh, I love that. I mean, I just got to get the money for it, but that's
Yeah.
awesome though, because that's the way how it should be. That's what you just
Mm,
described. That's the best case scenario. So I think if people were more like that, we'd live in a happier world, honestly. And yeah,
agree.
I love that. That's so awesome. Man, wow, thank you so much for sharing that. And then also another little special shout out, another film you did, which you had a pretty prominent role, is Getting Toasted, which you also
Oh,
produced. I can't
yep.
leave without that mention. I watched it a few times. You're a great actor, Steve. You got to give yourself credit. You're an
Oh,
awesome
thank you.
actor.
Yeah.
As Deputy Smalls, loved all the scenes. It's you use that time. There's no, what's that quote? There's no small roles, only small actors, and you're definitely a great big actor. So, man, so with Pete's Dragon and Getting Toasted. So talk about, again, very quickly, how you got involved with Getting Toasted and then acting in it, because you were great. And it's on, you can purchase it on on all the streaming sites, Getting Toasted. And then that's a,
Yeah, yeah, it's all of the transactional VOD sites on in America.
yeah.
Yeah, that was oh, what's the fast version of that? So in 2014, 2015, I co-wrote a hip hop dance movie
Mhm.
because when you look at me, you think hip hop dance, clearly. But it's just because I understand how movies work, and I was able to watch a bunch of hip hop dance movies and figure out how they work. And I worked on that with a very talented a screenwriter and director. Uh, uh, she was named Casey Zilbert at the time. She now is Kasi Fanakta.
Okay.
Um, and they're now they. So sorry, I don't want to dead name
Gotcha. Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
The but we co-wrote that thing, which became it was the biggest New Zealand film in 2015, and they wanted to direct, but they present as a young, pretty woman.
Mhm.
And because of that presentation, they often are sort of kicked aside for other people who are elbowing their way in. And we knew if they wanted to direct and they just got in line, they would wait 6 years before
Yeah.
getting a chance. And so we're like, no, let's just make a thing.
Yeah.
Because I think Jim Cameron said, if you want to be a director, direct something, and then you're a director, and after that, you're just arguing about your quote.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so um, we got together because they and I do a lot of just helping our community. We have a lot of sort of social capital,
Mhm.
and we spent a lot of it. So we got 5 actors and 5 crew, and we made a feature film with 5 actors and 5 crew because of
Wow.
this thing I was just talking about. If so many New Zealanders know how to do multiple things,
Yeah.
and uh, Kasi's parents are farmers,
Mhm.
but they farm grapes instead of farming wheat or whatever. So they have a vineyard. And so Kasi came with an idea about a destination wedding is planned for this beautiful vineyard. And like 2 weeks out, the bride to be says, I don't want to marry you. And so the heartbroken groom, his best man says, look, we already rented the place. We have all this wine and food sitting there. Let's go anyway and have like a bros weekend. And so they and their old friend who runs the vineyard, who's a woman, uh, um, just have a boozy millennial get to know you weekend. And the woman who runs the thing, her younger sister shows up who wants to bring a little sexual healing to the groom, the heartbreaking groom. And the uncle of the bride who ran was like tramping in the Arctic or something and didn't hear that it was canceled and shows up. So
Yeah.
this American Ernest Hemingway type shows up. I actually grew the beard for that, and I haven't lost the beard yet.
Really?
Um,
Okay.
and yeah, so Kasi needed to have a chaos figure, a couple of chaos figures, who's the younger sister and the uncle. And so they're like, hey, I need an older American who will work for free and drink a lot of wine. Do you know anybody? And so they designed the role basically for what I do. And so I showed up and I got to, so I was producing, assistant directing, holding the boom every once in a while, and acting.
Wow.
And because all of us were just pitching in. It was a, hey guys, let's put on a show type situation.
Yeah.
And we shot the whole thing for only $20,000. And then
Wow.
there's a film commission here where like the government pays people money to make films, which is awesome.
Mhm.
And we got $40,000 out of them to do the post-production. And so
Wow.
we made a feature film for $60,000. And if you watch it, you can kind of tell in a few places that it was made cheap, but it feels like a real movie.
Wow.
And so yeah, if any of your watchers are thinking, hey man, what if we just go make a thing? Take a look at Getting Toasted and see that you can make something that looks like a real film, for not a whole lot of crazy money, for not millions of
Wow.
dollars.
I had no idea it was that low. I would have thought maybe a million or something like that. So just
Mm.
wow.
Telling you, New Zealanders are good, dude. New Zealanders are good at it.
Yeah, as like Hollywood take note what everyone's doing in New Zealand. I mean, that's
Yeah,
wow.
right.
That's so cool. And that's great without the unions. You could do the the boom operation or anything you
Mm.
need to do, but that's fantastic. Yeah, and that's a great film too. And again, great acting. I love that the grizzledness of the character, and I love in that scene because there's one scene in particular I love. It's the bonding moment. You have a character, spoilers for those who haven't seen the movie, but there's a character who just learned that his girlfriend is pregnant and he's has no idea. He's worried about being a father because he never had the parental figure. And then your character basically takes him under his wing. And I think you just show him how to fight, and you're doing this punching match. And I love it because it's just it's like this bonding, like the parental figure with the young person who's about to be a father, and you're just fighting. And then it's the next morning, it's already morning. You've guys been, bonding, fisting it out. And then you just light back on the lawn, and there's all these geese surrounded by you. So, would you be able to very quickly talk about that scene too? Like, because it's great, because I like and then of course it's like, all right, just lie with all these geese, hoping they're not going to pick my ears or anything like that.
Yeah, right. That they are they're ducks actually.
Oh,
Because geese are angry birds. I'm terrified of geese. They're
yeah.
monster birds.
Okay.
But yeah, the vineyard has a bunch of these ducks that they just started feeding and getting used to people in preparation for us coming and doing the show. Um, so yeah, it's a weird thing. The character Vance, who's the younger man who's just realized he's going to become a father, and he's on the verge. Like the character is really well designed because he's a sweet guy, but you can see he could take one step into becoming
Yeah.
toxically masculine. And then he meets a guy who's been through toxic masculinity and came out the other side, which is my character. And anytime even the concept of I'm going to show you I love you by punching you in the face is a really toxic thing to do, but we somehow managed to do it in the thing where it's actually that's what comes across because he's never been in a fight before. And my sort of Ernest Hemingway man's man thing is like, you're not a man unless you've been in a fight. Let's go
Yeah.
have a fight. And yet it's done with caring,
Yeah.
weirdly.
Hmm.
And so then we wake up and also they're in the story they're all drinking wine all the time, so you're also hungover when you
Yeah.
wake up. And we did the fight scene on the same grass verge on the edge of the pond where we then pass out and then wake up in the morning. Um, it was so slippery because there was so much duck poop
Oh, so
everywhere,
uh,
everywhere. So we're and because I'm teaching them how to throw me. I'm doing all this like judo stuff, and we just keep landing, and when we landed, it squished. It was that much duck poop.
Oh my God.
And it was in our hair, it was in our
Oh,
clothes. It was so slippery and gross. And it was such a bonding moment between me and Nick, who's just this really cool young man.
oh man.
Um, and yeah, so then we wake up in the morning and we couldn't get the smell of duck poop out of us for like a week. People would come into a room with us and be like, "Oh, yeah, no, it's still there, guys. It's still
Oh,
there."
oh my gosh. Wow. Oh my gosh.
But it
Wow.
was all run and gun. We shot that whole movie in 2 weeks because Kasi designed a structured improv.
Mhm.
Like the script was, here's how the scene opens and what all the characters want. Here's a turn in the scene. Here's how the scene ends. And if we had that, we would just go
Mhm.
and run and gun. And so even the fight scene there, Nick and I choreographed in the moment of doing it. And
Really?
even some stuff that's in the final thing was him and I just working out what the moves are with different sound put on top of it, makes it seem like we're actually doing the moves. And it was just a fascinating, like practical, get on set and work stuff out. And by the end, we had a thing that was good to show to people. It was awesome.
Wow. So I had no idea that I wasn't sure if there was a choreographer, but if you've had a crew of 5 people, so it was just you two choreographing that fight.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because I have a background in martial arts, and Nick is a natural athlete, and so between us, we were able to do. Because I think there's some like wrist grabs. There's a couple of punches. There's a throw and an arm lock, and so it's not super complicated stuff, but it's actually the throw that we do as a stage fighting throw
Yeah.
because it looks like you're really yoinking someone, but they land on their feet. They don't land on their
Yes.
head, you know.
Exactly.
And so I think that's one thing I learned at USC was how to do that throw. And that's the one thing I took from my $100,000 USC education was how to do one stage fighting throw.
Well,
Done.
that I would say that's still a good investment. Like, yeah, and he used it.
Right.
Oh, wow, but yeah, so I know I could talk to you for hours and hours, but I know I gotta let you go. I know you have important stuff to do, but thank you so much for just coming on my show and just sharing the ins and outs of screenwriting, how Hollywood works, what not to do. I love the New Zealand example. I think everyone should do that. So, but
Mm,
Steve, thank you so much. Seriously, thank you so much for coming on my show,
absolutely.
and truly an honor.
My pleasure, Reed. It's been great to talk with you.
Thank you so much for watching my conversation with special guest Steve Barr. If you have enjoyed this episode of Reed's Conversations, be sure to click the like button and subscribe button on my YouTube channel. That way you will be notified for future upcoming episodes. To learn more about screenwriting, visit Terry Rossio's website, www.wordplayer.com.